It's nice. We've been looking forward to this event starting, so it's nice to see everybody collecting here. Today I'll talk about one aspect of the work in my lab that is related to understanding how auditory information is represented when we're not actively attending to it. So my lab at the University College London, in London, in the UK, is using a variety of different techniques to understand what information listeners extract from sound. So a lot of our work is based on brain imaging, like EEG and MEG and sound fMRI, and we do some eye tracking and also a lot of behavioral work to try to understand, how listeners use sounds to interact with their surroundings. And specifically, the way our approach is sort of targeting these questions is by sort of designing simple tasks using simple stimuli that we believe embody or sort of model the challenges that listeners face in complex environments. And then we seek to understand how the brain is dealing with these challenges. And in particular, the kind of questions that we're asking is sort of embodied in this picture. So this is my son over here, and he's exploring a new multisensory environment. This is a Grand Central Station in New York. And he's using all of his senses to understand the space. But probably if you'd asked him, what is it that how he perceives this world, he would probably describe it in terms of his visual experiences, right? I mean, this is what the sense that we consciously draw on to describe our experiences. But unbeknownst to him, in fact, he's using all of his senses. And what I would like to argue as an auditory scientist, he is really using sound to help him understand the environment that he's in. Sound is the most distal sense, in the sense that we are sensitive to sounds all around us. The visual system might be limited by a certain angle in front of our, related to the sort of direction of gaze, whereas our ears are sensitive to information above us, below us, in the dark, when we're attending to other things, and even when we're sleeping. And this has resulted in the hypothesis that what the auditory system is doing, or what it might have evolved to do, is to be the brain's early warning system. So a system that's continually scanning our surroundings whilst we're doing all the things that we consciously want to do, and alerting us to potential danger. So we all have these intuitive experiences where we hear something and then we turn to look at it, right? And an important aspect of this sort of hypothesis is that, of course, if it were to serve as an early warning system, it has to operate automatically. So it has to be, in some sense, independent of the rest of of the rest of our conscious experiences. And so the question that I want to address in this talk is to what extent is that true? Or put differently, how is the auditory environment represented when we're not actively attending to it, which is arguably most of the time. And it has some, important implications. So this is a cyclist near where I work in London, and presumably he is focusing on the visual scene. He's trying to navigate his way safely to where he needs to go. But presumably a lot of really survival-related information he's receiving through his ears, outside of his field of view. So understanding how our brain is able to track this information when we're focused elsewhere has important implications for our understanding of how the brain deals with these sorts of situations. And there's a lot of work showing that a lot of auditory processes seem to happen outside of the focus of attention. So some of the key processing that we believe is characterizing hearing, like ground segregation, like detecting novelty, all of that seems to take place even when we're not actively attending to sound. So using bristle, these studies that are cited here from my lab, and there's loads and loads of others, have shown that if you have people sit and read a book while recording their brain responses to various sounds, these can show evidence of segregation, evidence of detecting changes, evidence of extracting some sort of form of meaning, and evidence of tracking quite complex sort of statistics of sounds. But, and this has given rise to this hypothesis that, or sort of our baseline hypothesis that auditory processing might be encapsulated from other things. So, you know, we have the auditory system, it does what it has to do, there are certain processing resources that are dedicated to achieving those goals, and they're encapsulated from everything else. And that might, you know, for if you think of the auditory system as an early warning system, that would be a good design feature for a system like this. But then, of course, if we want to understand whether that is indeed the case, what we want to ask is not how is the auditory scene represented when we're not actively listening to it, but what we want to do is we want to be able to do something much stricter, which is we want to deplete resources, and we want to understand how auditory information is represented when you're highly loaded. So when we are giving you a task of a very, very high demand. And today I'll focus on a subset of this that is related to high visual load. So how is auditory information represented when you're working hard on a visual task? And so to do that, we needed to do two things. So we needed to find a really hard visual task, and also to find a really hard, or what we believe would be a hard, auditory task. And so one candidate for a very hard auditory task is this phenomenon of repetition-based segregation that is based on a paper by Josh McDermott from some years ago, from when he was in Andrew Oxenham's lab. And what the stimulus is sort of depicted here. So the idea is to create these sort of artificial sounds that have certain properties of natural sounds, in the sense that they have low temporal and spatial transition probability, so they're kind of sort of continuous sounds. So these are a few examples. I can play a few. So they kind of sound like this. These kinds of sounds. The reason these sounds are interesting is because although they're created to share certain properties with natural sounds, they lack a very fundamental property that makes it very easy for us to segregate them. And that property is sort of harmonic structure. So these are examples of spectrograms of natural sounds, and they have these sort of very, very idiosyncratic harmonic structure that when we mix these two sounds together, for example, we'll be able to segregate them. We'll know like which bits belong to the speech and which bits belong to the bullfrog based on these properties. The sounds that are used in this repetition-based segregation paradigm lack these properties, such that if I take one sound, this one, and then mix it with another sound, that one, these are the two sounds that I play to you, and I can play them again. So this is one of them, and this is the other one. If I mix them, you can't segregate the two. So there's no cues within this signal to indicate that it's actually a mixture of two sounds. But what Josh showed in his paper is that your brain can learn, or can learn to segregate one sound from a mixture if you present it multiple times, but together with a different distractor. So here this was one presentation of a target mixed with a particular distractor. But if I change the distractor each time, your brain can learn to segregate it. So this is an example of a sound that's going to be presented, I forget how many times, maybe 10 times, mixed with different distractors. And you can see that over time you learn, you detect the presence of this repeating target within the changing background. So the bit at the end was the repeating one. I'll play it again. Yeah? It's hard in this room, but people can do this. So the task that Josh gave them was this exact task. So they would hear some sort of repeating sort of mixture, and then they'd hear a probe like you did at the end, and they had to say whether that probe was the repeating one or not. And people could do it quite well. But this is quite a hard task. So the hypothesis for what you need to accomplish to be able to detect this repeating target is some sort of autocorrelation. So the idea is that the brain remembers and sort of compares the sound as it unfolds, and through a process of kind of averaging over time, it deduces what the repeating target is. And so this was a good candidate for a hard task because it requires non-trivial computation. And also when I was chatting to Josh about it, he said he does not believe that this thing can happen automatically. I mean, he said that when he was listening to these stimuli, he felt that he really needed to focus in order to hear out the target. So it made a good kind of candidate hard task to try. And so we took this task, and we wanted to ask whether this sort of processing depends on the availability of processing resources. And this was a behavioral paradigm. So what we had listeners do is we had them do two tasks concurrently. So they were listening to these mixtures of sounds. So there was a repeating, well, half of them. Well, no, there was a repeating target with a bunch of distractors. And at the end, they heard a probe, and they had to say whether the probe was the repeating sound or not. And at the same time as they were doing that, they were also performing a decoy task, which I will explain in a second. And then they had to respond first to the mixtures, and then to the decoy task. The task that we chose for the first task that we chose to study was a multiple object tracking task. So it's a visual task that is known to be very hard, and it's known to sort of eat up processing resources. And what you need to do in this task is sort of shown here. So participants look at the screen. There is a whole bunch of stationary dots. And there are four in this instance, dots that are highlighted in red. And then they all start, then the red ones become black again, and everything starts moving for 3.7 seconds, which is the duration of the interval where we're presenting the sounds as well. And then everything stops, and they have to indicate with the mouse the dots that they were, the red dots. So they had to track these red dots as they were moving, try to avoid confusing them with the other dots, and then they had to indicate whether these were the ones that they were tracking. Well, importantly, and because it was a dual task paradigm, what we wanted them to do is we wanted them to really focus all of their efforts on the decoy task. And we told them that they were paid and sort of rewarded and received positive reinforcement based on how well they did on this visual task. We told them that there's going to be sounds in the background, that they are not really important, and that they should basically guess if they can't solve the task. There are problems inherent with this approach, and these are general problems that are inherent to using dual task paradigms, and I will kind of touch on them at the end. But anyway, this is what they were doing, and of course we needed to adjust this task so that it's very hard, but not impossible, because if we make it too hard, then what will happen is people will just give up. And hence, we wouldn't have depleted resources. They would have all the resources that available, because they would not be performing the visual task. So we had a sort of pilot study where we looked at how people's ability to perform this task changes with speed. And we ended up deciding on two levels of difficulty. So the high demand task was this one, where performance on average was about 60% correct, which is what we wanted. We wanted it to be hard but doable, right? And then this one was the low demand task, where people were basically at ceiling. And they did it in sort of short mini blocks of either low demand or high demand tasks. So this is their performance on the visual task. What is shown here is performance on practice here, and then this is the performance on the low demand visual task. That's quite high, like we expected. Performance on the high demand visual task is lower, but still high, which is important, right? They were doing the task. And this is the performance on the segregation task. So basically there's no difference. Which was very interesting for us, because it meant that despite the fact that they were dealing with this very difficult visual task, they could still do what we as experimenters thought was an objectively hard task. So we tried another task which we thought would be maybe even harder. And this one involved a rapid serial visual presentation of numbers, like what is shown here. And what participants had to do is they had to remember the particular order of the numbers within the sequence. And then at the end of the trial, they would be presented with a probe like this, and they had to say whether 7 came exactly after 3. So the numbers were always present in the sequence, but not necessarily exactly following each other. So here, the answer is no, because 7 didn't come after 3. That was the hard task. The easy task was just noticing, so once in a while, one of the numbers would have a red underline. And the task was just to say whether an underline was present or not, kind of anywhere. So we kept the probe format in the same way, because we wanted to keep the stimulus properties the same, but they knew in those conditions that what they just needed to do is to report whether one of the numbers was underlined. So that's objectively a very, very easy task. This one is a hard task. And what we did is we adjusted the difficulty of this high demand task for each participant. So we ran a little experiment beforehand on each person to look at how many numbers they could remember. So the length of the sequence that they could store in memory. And on most of the people, we kind of ended up settling on a sequence of 6 numbers that they had to remember. Some people had a bit more, and some people had a bit less, but on average it was about 6. And this is the dual task performance again, so in the same format as in the previous slide. It's a little bit messier now. You'll notice a few things that are. So if I go with the visual task, so the high demand visual task is at ceiling, as we expect. The low demand visual task is doable but hard, as we expect. But you can see that it's already, so this is the practice session. This is the high demand task kind of during the practice, so before it was paired with auditory stimulus. And we can see that in the previous one, the performance was about the same, so suggesting that the two tasks really did not interfere with each other. For this one, it was already a little bit messier in that there was a drop in performance. So once we added sound, their performance on the visual task that they were supposed to prioritize was already a little bit decreased. Objectively, there was a small, so the relevant differences between here and here that you're supposed to look at, there was a small, significant effective load. So they were a little bit worse here than they are here. So suggesting that load did affect processing, but the effect was so small that in the study we ended up concluding that segregation as repetition-based segregation is minimally affected by inattention, or robust inattention. But that was because the differences were small, but technically we did see a small effect of visual load, suggesting that possibly there is a sort of an interaction in processing resources. Now, what I said before, these sorts of dual task paradigms are really problematic by nature, because although we do everything that we can to instruct our participants to ignore sound and just focus on the task that we define as the main task, we do test them on both of them. And I have this sort of saying in my lab that participants are smart and evil, in that they will figure out what you don't want them to do and they will do it. And in dual task paradigms, this is an inherent problem. Of course, the more direct measure with which one should kind of answer these sorts of questions is a situation where the auditory stimulation is indeed not relevant and where participants are entirely naive to the fact that we're interested in sound. And this is something that is achievable by using brain imaging. So we can present a visual task of high or low demand and look at brain responses to sounds. And this is what I'm going to be talking about in the sort of next part of this talk. So from now on, sounds are never behaviorally relevant. And these are a series of experiments that we performed recently with Lily Levy via a shared PhD student who performed the work. So the first question that we asked in this, these are a series of MEG studies, is whether high visual load can affect onset responses, so very simple brain responses to very simple sounds. So the sounds that we used were pure tones, just sounds. And they were presented concurrently with a high or low load visual task. So specifically, the paradigm that we used in this study is sort of depicted here. So listeners were looking at a computer screen. There was a fixation cross. And then very briefly, for 100 milliseconds, they received a search array. So it was a circle around fixation with a bunch of letters. And then there was a sort of a blank screen thereafter, during which they had to provide their response. And what they were doing is they were, on each one of these trials, they were determining whether an X or a Z were present in this display. This is a hard task because all of these letters are very edgy. So it's, in order to determine in 100 milliseconds whether an X or a Z was present, you have to first encode this array, and then you have to search it, to do kind of feature conjunction search to find whether there's a Z or an X. The easy task is shown here. So this is the low-low task where we had smaller sort of zeros and then either a Z or an X. And that's sort of a trivially easy task. On half of the trials, together with this visual display, we also presented these tones. So the tones were of variable frequency, and they were quite soft. So they were 12 dB above the digital threshold. So they were clearly audible, but they were soft in nature. And these sounds were never relevant. What participants were told is we told them that we were very careful about the positioning of their head in the MEG machine, and once in a while there's going to be kind of a mechanical sound that has to do with taking a measurement, and like if they hear it, they should ignore it. So that was the explanation we gave to them. And these are the data. So this is what we expect a standard auditory response to look like. This is 0 when this tone is presented, and there's a standard sort of kind of prototypical sequence of onset responses of 50 milliseconds and then a big one at 100 milliseconds. And they're generated sort of roughly around auditory cortex. So this is the response that I want you to keep in mind for the next slides. Importantly, like I said before, these tones were 100 milliseconds. They exactly coincided with the display. So at the point in the trial where the demand on processing resources was the highest. And these are the data. So what I'm plotting in green is this response to sounds under low visual load. And what is plotted in black is the response to the same sounds under high visual load. And what you can see is that there are two places during this response where load had an effect. First, during the sort of onset response, so load attenuated the initials of the onset response to sound. But in addition, load pretty much abolished this sort of later response, what we call the P3. So the P3 response is a response that happens around 300 milliseconds after sound onset. And it's associated with becoming aware of a stimulus that's usually sort of, that is either surprising or that you are not actively seeking. And this response is present in the low-load case, but it's so basically almost entirely absent in the high-load case. And so the way we interpreted these, these are the brain areas where this interaction happens. for the implant. The way we interpreted these findings is that this focused, very, very focused visual attention, attenuated responses to simple sounds, so responses that we normally think of as entirely automatic and, like possibly encapsulated as just a simple response to a pure tone, was affected by an entirely unrelated but loading visual. And this kind of later effect is interesting because it can suggest that extreme distraction, so in this case, it was an extreme case where we depleted their resources exactly at the same time when the sound is present, and it can make certain sounds, what I mean by inaudible is you are not going to become aware of them, so technically they are inaudible. Now this needs to be taken with a caveat in that we didn't ask them. I mean, this was a task where sounds were entirely irrelevant, so we kind of don't know whether they were or not aware of these sounds. But the absence of this response and the link to this previous work that links this response to awareness suggests that that's probably the case. So what this shows is that visual load can, so to speak, like tune the gain on auditory sensory processing. So it can sort of reduce the gain on early responses to sounds. But a follow-up question is whether visual load can do more than that. So can visual load also affect the computational capacity of the auditory system? So can the depletion of resources affect what the auditory system can do? And to try to answer this question, we turn to a different stimulus that models figure ground information. So I'll walk through the stimulus and I'll explain why it's computationally demanding, and then we'll see whether load can affect these processes. So the stimulus that we use is a stimulus that we call the stochastic figure ground stimulus. It's shown here. So it basically consists of sequences of chords of pure tones, where the frequency components in each chord are just chosen randomly for each chord. Each chord here is 25 milliseconds long. And it sounds kind of like this. So just like a random tone cloud. What we can do to introduce a figure in this sort of stimulus is to fix the frequencies in some of the components across chords. So I've highlighted it in green, and I'll try to play it. So the stimulus that I will play is not exactly this one because it's very hard to hear. So I'll play two variants that might make the figure easier to hear in this setting. So the first one. There's a figure appearing kind of part way through the stimulus. So see if you can hear it. You hear it as a kind of warble within this otherwise random sequence. With headphones, it's pretty easy to hear. And the second example is a longer version of that shorter one that I played. So this one I hope you all heard. Yeah? I'll play it again. In the actual experiment, we use short stimuli. So our stimuli are 200 milliseconds long, so these are very brief. The stimulus models the challenges of listening to naturalistic sound mixtures. So when we listen to two speakers talking, the frequency content associated with one speaker, so here drawn in red, is entirely mixed with the frequency content from another speaker, so here drawn in blue. And the challenges that the auditory system has to face is to kind of, is to segregate the two, is to put all the red ones together and all the blue ones together. And for this stimulus, it's kind of the same. So the figure, the nice thing about this sort of signal is that the figure and the background are entirely overlapping in frequency space. To be able to extract the figure from the background, you have to somehow integrate information over time and over frequency. And specifically, if you look at any particular point in time, you cannot tell which is the figure and which is the ground. So you can hear because they're in green. But had I only presented the snippet here, you cannot tell. You can only start extracting the figure by detecting over time that a certain subset of components is repeating. And in previous work from our lab, and there's other labs that are sort of taking on this work, we've demonstrated that people are very, very sensitive to these sorts of signals, and they can detect them very rapidly and robustly. So in one study over here, we showed that when you moderately distract them, so when they're watching a movie while listening to these things, we can see clear brain responses to these sorts of sounds. And we've replicated that in this study. So what we are showing here is participants, this is our MEG setup. They're watching, they're performing a very easy visual task. So they're looking at images and they're doing like a one-back type task. And this is the MEG response to the figure absent. So these are the stimuli where there's no figure, and the figure present stimuli. So you can see that there's the green one is the one where there's no figure. The sort of olive one is the one where a figure is present. And there is this what we call the figure-related negativity. So the difference between the two is the quantity that reflects the fact that the brain has computed the presence of the figure. And you can see that that response is present from very early on in the signal and kind of throughout when people are sort of moderately distracted. But what happens if we modulate our load systematically? So what we did in this experiment is so what this one is showing is that when resources are not depleted, the auditory system can respond to these figures even in the absence of attention, and it happens even for very brief figures, the figures that are 200 milliseconds long, so these are very brief stimuli. And it happens, it starts very early on, so the brain can detect this presence very quickly. But so what happens if we deplete resources? And the way we depleted them was very similar to the previous tasks that I've shown you. Exactly the previous task didn't quite work because we needed to lengthen the presentation of the stimulus to 200 milliseconds, and the search task, when you lengthen the time during which the display is present, becomes too easy. So it wasn't loading enough. So we changed the task to a slightly different task, where what people had to do is they had to do either a feature search or a feature conjunction search. So they were looking at a display of shapes and colors like this, and in the high-low task, they had to respond to a particular conjunction, so they had to detect a red square. And in the low-low task, they had to just detect red. And we made sure that everything is entirely matched and so on, and then so that the visual stimuli were exactly the same. And like before, on half of the trials, we presented an auditory stimulus during the display. And this auditory stimulus was either had no figure or had a figure in it. By the way, something that I'm glossing over entirely in this talk is actually really important, and you can come and ask me about it later, is how we separate brain responses. So in all of these paradigms, so the previous one and this one, we have visual stimuli that are presented concurrently with sound. And what I've been showing to you before is responses to sound. And you should ask yourself, how can I do that given that I have a visual stimulus presented entirely at the same time? The reason I'm sort of glossing over it is because it's basically for timing reasons. The way we do it is we use a sort of PCA type approach where we contrast the trials. So we always have half of our trials never have sound presented. So sound is presented only during half of the trials. So what we do is we use this PCA type approach to find the difference in responses to trials that have sound present versus trials that have no sound. And what this enables us to do is fish out specifically auditory responses. And then it's these responses that we analyze. And I can explain that in more details to anybody who might be interested. It's a very powerful technique and one that we can verify, so we can show that the responses we've extracted are auditory, they localize to auditory areas and so on. But back to this one. So this is our this is our loading paradigm, and like I said, the low load was a pop-out feature, so they were just searching for a particular color. In the high load, they were looking for a shape-color combination. And what this is showing you is just their performance on the visual task. This is just to convince you that our load manipulation has been achieved. So performance is always better in low load relative to high load, and also faster in low load relative to high load. And these are our brain responses. So what I'm going to show you is exactly the same stimuli, the same responses that I've shown you before. So the super clean ones that I've shown here are based on something like 600 trials in the absence of concurrent visual stimuli. What I'm showing you here is responses to about 80 trials. But in the case where we had to separate the auditory responses from visual stimulation that was presented entirely concurrently, and it's quite remarkable that we get a very similar type of response, albeit a bit noisier. So what I'm showing here again is, so the dark green is the stimuli where there was no figure. The light green are the stimuli where the figure was present. So what we call the figure-related negativity is present during this period that's highlighted in gray. And what is plotted here is the direct subtraction. So we just subtracted this one from that one to show you the figure-related response. And you can see that it's present as we'd expect. And in the low-load trials, this is the same, sorry, in the high-load trials, these are the same data. So what you can see already by eye is that the response to the ground, so when the figure is absent, the response pretty much doesn't change, and this is confirmed by statistics when we compare them directly. The response to the figure present is now much closer to the response to the figure absent, so the figure-related negativity is smaller overall, which is what is shown here. And of course, to be able to claim a difference between the two, we have to do an interaction. And this is what is shown here. So this is the interaction of load on the response to the figure. And there's a big sort of significant effect that is driven by the response to figure presence. So it's driven by change to this signal, but not to the figure absent signal. And the brain areas in which responses are modulated are what we know to be sort of classically auditory areas. So the superior temporal gyrus and the planum temporale. And in fact, these are brain areas where, in sort of previous work, the computations that are related to extracting these figures have been demonstrated. And so the conclusion is that segregation can be disrupted when an active visual task places a high enough demand on resources. It's important that in this experiment, unlike in the previous one, we made sure that the initial responses to sounds are not attenuated. So we presented our sounds really loudly. And indeed, when we look at onset, there is no difference. The load does not affect these early responses to sound. And we can see that by, for example, looking at the figure absent stimuli the load didn't affect the response to these two stimuli. It only affected the response to the figure present signals. Which we interpret as suggesting that load can affect the computational capacity of the auditory system, in addition to sort of dampening responses overall when the signals are sufficiently weak. So these are kind of sad news for the cyclist here, and maybe kind of a little bit sad news for our possibly naive hypothesis that auditory processing is encapsulated. It clearly isn't. I mean, it is. We can affect what we might consider as fundamental, sort of low-level responses to sound by manipulating visual load. But it's important to also keep in mind that we only achieved these large effects on sound because we, in the lab, were able to artificially align the time at which the visual task draws on resources with the time at which we present the stimuli. So there was all of the tasks that worked well were tasks where visual resources were needed at a particular point in time, and it was at that time that we presented sounds. It's unlikely that in the real world this sort of tight alignment between vision and audition is present, and hence it means that, I guess, generally speaking, the effect of visual load on sound is maybe better approximated by these behavioral tasks that I showed in the beginning. So kind of an overall, a kind of smaller, potentially negligible effect. But when we do align them, these large effects that we see suggests that the systems do draw on the same computational capacity. And so the conclusions would be that the auditory and visual processing share computational resources. And what that means is the responses to unattended sounds can be affected quite dramatically by what visual task people are performing. And in extreme situations, this can lead to what we call an attentional deafness, or sort of failure to become aware of certain sounds. But like I said, in most cases, either when your load is not, when your resources are not depleted, auditory processing does take place automatically, so it doesn't require focused attention. That's in line with the sort of load theory of processing. And of course, there's lots and lots and lots of questions that relates to what is the nature of these shared resources. So, where are they? What kind of is there something about sound that is encapsulated and other things that these shared resources contribute to? I mean, all of these are sort of ongoing questions. So thank you for your attention, and thank you to my awesome, crazy bunch of people who chose to come and work with me.